Australia.
Hi.
So the question we've been invited to discuss is how Lonergan's thought has helped us meet the challenges of today and how it might help us meet the challenges of the future. And my strong surmise is the one they really want to hear from is you. And that's also the one I really want to hear from. So since you proposed the question for your workshop, maybe you would mind taking a stab at it.
Sure. Well, I started off as a seminarian, and we had a wonderful seminary, and I was in a wonderful class of really inquisitive and smart people. And we were really brought up on pre-Vatican II theology, the style of theology and religion courses. And so, as a seminarian, we were often assigned to take census in different parishes where I happened to live, and many of those places in Southern California were inhabited by people with graduate degrees in all kinds of fields, especially scientific ones. So although many of them were estranged from their faith, they were interested in their faith, but whereas they were super adults in their fields, they were relative children in their understanding of the faith. Nevertheless, I realized I wasn't up to answering their questions, which truly bothered me. And at the same time, we were starting to do philosophy, and in philosophy we had standard Latin textbooks in the more or less Suarezsian tradition, which were conceptualist and ahistorical, and I couldn't understand them. I was a good enough student to be able to memorize the answers, but I would have liked to understand them. And so we started off with material logic, which turned out to be a sort of scheme of what you would get from cognitional theory if you never studied cognitional theory. And so that drove us to look for people like Maritain and Gilson to answer further questions, and I wasn't satisfied with them. So in the library, looking through periodicals in St. John's Library in Camarillo, California, I came across, providentially, the Verbum articles. And so, for the first time, just reading the first article, I realized, well, I can't understand this. And so that was a tremendous gift. So I read through all the articles, and I made index cards of my notes on them, which were pretty substantial. And because at seminary we often had reading at table where you could not hear the reading, because of the clatter of dishes and so forth, I read those things and thought about those things. And I was so utterly grateful. And it gave me a way of realizing that my faith really wasn't a truth that we took for granted by believing it, out of tremendous goodwill, I think, but also it was something that was intelligible and would really be the basis for answering those kinds of questions in a pastoral situation. So I realized then that wanting to be a good pastor and a good priest, I, in the summers, tried to work with good pastors and good priests. And one of them had us teach vacation Bible school in different backyards of what was a very Spanish and African American part of Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, where later on the riots in Watts took place, and South Central LA. And I always took responsibility for those. And but I had experiences there working with people on a big project across the street from this lovely, lovely family named Green. The father worked 3 or 4 jobs, and the mother, with her little crowd of kids, let them participate in my shoddy attempts at teaching catechism in the backyard. First, we will honor God. Second, honor His name, and so forth. And so what happened was we realized that this place was awful, in the sense that you couldn't even, when you went near it, you would always smell rotting food. And eventually it worked out that I was able to work with the landlord or the owner of the project to get paint and stuff, and to work with teenage kids whom I also did Bible study with as we worked, and a lot of working with their probation officers. And so it was an experience of getting insights into concrete situations, which is really what Lonergan was all about. And it was at that time when I visited a Catholic bookstore further up Vermont Avenue, where I came across the book Insight. And I thought, and it dawned on me, hey, this is the same guy who wrote those articles I liked so much. So I started poring over that, the first of many trips, and I realized that this once again jived with my experience, so when I was sent to Rome to do further studies, my theology studies, one of my North American college colleagues named Emil Piscitelli told me that, did you know that Lonergan is teaching there? I hadn't even known.
Is that when you were on the boat already?
Yeah, on the boat, on the way to Naples. And then then who met us at the when we got off the boat, but Joe Kamanchak and David Tracy, who were both the prototypical 90-pound weaklings. But being from New York, they explained to us that they sent us because we were the healthiest of all. And on the bus ride, I got to be friends with Joe Kamanchak, who through the years, really, through the year that he was there, plied me with all kinds of writings by Lonergan and encouraged my study of Lonergan. And eventually I was encouraged, because I had a lot of questions, to go see Lonergan myself, which I did. And by the time I did, I realized that the classes at the Greg were basically a waste of time, because people read their notes or lectured from their notes in Latin, and I realized, well, I can read and I know Latin, so what's the use? So I told Lonergan.
They didn't take, there were no Q&A at the end of the lecture? Or?
No,
Really?
no, it was monological. And so 80 countries worth of people going to all those lectures. So I realized, well, there are things I want to read and study, and I asked Lonergan about 3 different proposals. I said I wanted to go on a binge, and so he talked for 20 minutes about Newman, which was one of my choices, and then about Ronner, about whom he was tremendously kind, and then the last choice was reading Insight carefully. And the big joke is, of course, that he didn't talk long there. He said, well, it'll put a little order in your life. That's one of the most fantastic things that failed. Nevertheless, because we were doing the Trinity, and he allowed me to go to his Trinity and variable courses, luckily before he left to get his operation. The kids my fellow students used to come to me for help, and we set up going through De Trino carefully, and realizing that what was at stake was something like intellectual conversion in different terms from Verbum and insight. And that was a wonderful communal thing. And that's one thing that I found true with Lonergan, that taking him seriously is really an opportunity to build up common meaning and common values and true friendships, which have put me in good stead ever since. And so when I saw Lonergan a year later during the Verbum thing, I went to see him, and he said, "Have you been on any more binges lately?" So, but the thing was, I realized perhaps I was called to be a teacher rather than a priest.
Right.
And I was able to study a lot of things because I didn't go to the grave. So except for Lonergan's courses.
Yeah.
So since I did, I recalled, as Matt Lamb related later on, that he recalled when we asked him particularly sticky questions, the first thing he'd say to us is, "Can you read German?" So I had the idea that if you're going to be serious in theology, you should know the German context. So I went to the University of Basel, and spent 6 years in Germany learning the German context. And I did my dissertation. My dissertation proposal was on Gadamer, whom he had quoted in his exercitatio courses on the method of theology. And I presented it to what we call in Germany, my doctor father, and he thought it was wonderful, but he said, "Aber Herr Lawrence, ist das Theologie?" So I realized I had to make it theological, so I wrote what Lonergan called 2 dissertations, one on Gadamer and one on Lonergan. I thought Gadamer presented what hermeneutics should be about in the deepest sense, and Lonergan was the example of carrying that out. And because everything was based on his 11 years of apprenticeship to Thomas Aquinas, understanding him correctly. But also, one of the great products of that was being able to read authors that had quite different views, but it made me able to make the best of them, and therefore not to always be in a controversial stance against their opinions, but learning from them, and also getting ideas about how to reverse their counterpositions. So that's a thing that really all my life has helped me as a teacher here at BC.
Well, I remember at my dissertation defense, you read me the passage from the Constitutione Christi, where he says, if you would be of service to others, you must not only exist yourself, but also help them exist, and not merely prove them wrong. And that was the entree to a gentle remark about the way I had handled some of my interlocutors, which I never forgot.
Right. Well, that fits into the fact that during that time in Rome, Existenza and Aggiornamento came out, and you quoted Lonergan's talking about exist,
yeah.
and that's the meaning of existence in that title, but also to talk about conversion. And in that quote that I read you, it said, "Don't try to prove them wrong,
Right, but help them.
invite them to be converted."
Right, yeah, that's right.
And so conversion became a central theme for me in my life, and it is the thing that, especially as a teacher, you teach all kinds of people, but a lot of them are really open to be converted. And so you have the opportunity to suggest different kinds of conversion, intellectual, moral, and religious. And as a teacher of undergraduates, we're most interested in religious conversion, since most of our undergrads are now nominally Christian, if at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really a wonderful thing, because you knew that really being Christian had to do with the encounter with the crucified and risen Christ. And once that becomes clear to people, then also many of the teachings of the church become plausible to them. And so that's just been a wonderful thing for me.
Can I ask a follow-up question about when you were talking about your dissertation, you said, well, you did 2 dissertations, and so Gadamer sort of provided the introduction to what hermeneutics was about, and Lonergan the implementation, and then you referenced his work on Thomas Aquinas. So Lonergan was doing his own theorizing at that stage about hermeneutics and trying to intercept Gadamer and relate it to his own cognitional theory. So you made it sound, well, not necessarily leaving it at this size, but that Lonergan largely was an example of actually a careful retrieval of the thought of Thomas Aquinas from underneath the veneer of the Baroque interpreters and so forth.
That's precisely the gift that I received, and what I realized he was reenacting because of his prior interest already in method and in intelligence rather than concepts. He was prepared to for example, in the Grace and Freedom articles, he made this wonderful point that it's one thing to try to understand the author when they say the same thing and again, but it's another thing to understand a really intelligent author who changes his mind and tells you why he changes his mind. And then in Verbum, the whole issue there has to do with the claim that Thomas Aquinas really did appropriate the structure of his own cognitional intentionality and conscious intentionality, and also performatively realized what Lonergan turned out to mean by consciousness as experience. And so I gave, when Gadamer came to BC several years ago, I asked him if he'd be willing to read my dissertation and correct me about the thing that I was mistaken about. And he said, well, it's funny because when we talked about it, because the thing you bring out is what I mean by consciousness, is the same thing that when Heidegger read this, he didn't like. But you understood what I meant. And that was my parade example of making the best of an author. Right. And also we had his hermeneutics, the ontological section of his hermeneutics has to do with a metaphysics of finitude. And so he had a notion of what we would call the agent intellect, which was really more like and this is what I think is true about the German tradition by and large, which is more like what Kant called the intuitus originarius, which is contrasted with our kind of intuition. And I said, well, that's not true. It's not an object like that, and it's not an intuition. It's wonder. And so he was kind of surprised that so it's weird to, I mean, I learned so much from him, but it was odd to, so in other words, Lonergan gave me the gift of understanding what that meant, and not only understanding it, but making it central to his whole project.
Right.
Which has to do with wonder, and ends up in method with saying that, just claiming straight out that the question about God is more significant than the answer. So there you have a really wonderful way of thinking about religious experience that is connected to the dynamisms of being authentic in a way that very often religious experience is not talked about. And certainly that threw tremendous light on the the Ignatian exercises. And so followers of Lonergan and others were clear that this so-called examination of conscience is the examination of consciousness. So that was a real leg up, and another great gift that Lonergan gave me.
In your book, in the introduction that you wrote for your book, you make this remark, which is not explicitly developed, but always intrigued me, that the functional specialties articulate the ontological structure of the hermeneutical circle. And I wonder, since we've kind of wandered into that a little bit by talking about your dissertation work, if you would say a little bit more about that. I think I asked you once before, and you just smiled and said, well, it does, or they do, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, it really has to do with Gadamer's notion of the fusion of horizons, Horizont, Vermelzung, that you come to interpret. So what Lonergan calls in method and in other writings the principle of the empty head is just simply wrong. And that to the degree that you're you have in your background or in your horizon any kind of authenticity that you gain from the tradition, that prepares you to hear the word, as he puts it, in terms of the indirect discourse of the scholarly side of the functional specialties. And that's true from textual criticism through interpretation and history and so forth, all the way to dialectic. So I thought, what a tremendous way of sharing what was central to Gadamer and being able to spell it out in relation to the whole project of human sciences. And so what I mean by the ontological structure has to do with a notion of metaphysics that's clear about enumerating the necessary conditions for the truthfulness of any contingent predication. And that's what the totality of theology is really about. And again, because foundations really involves not simply having foundations, but which especially in a logical mode, but based on the conversions. That just makes the whole thing so beautifully well expressed, and to my mind, incomparable to anyone else. And so there is a way in which the way our theology departments are structured now, by no means according to functional specialization. In your own work, you can kind of see what you're doing all along the line,
Right.
and have the modesty to realize the shortcomings in your own conversions, in contact with the things we have to study and work with. So the other aspect is that somewhat in line with what we were discussing this morning with Rob. When Gadamer wrote Truth and Method, Habermas, who for some reason couldn't get his dissertation through the Frankfurt School, came to Gadamer, and Gadamer helped him get his doctorate.
Mm.
And yet one of the most meaningful critiques of Truth and Method came from Habermas, who was at that time thinking more along the lines of Hegelian Marxism in relation to praxis than he thought Gadamer was doing. And then, at the same time, the person who learned that if you want to learn theology, you better get to know the European or German context. Matt Lamb had started off with Seckler at Tübingen and then shifted to Metz, who had made this turn from Runnerian apostle to the initiator of political theology. And so from both ends, you really did see that there's a practical and political side to Lonergan's work. And that has helped me in terms of at least thinking about theology as political. I don't like the phrase political theology because it seems too pretentious, but theology has political implications, and then in that context,
Mm-hmm.
and in today's context, his foray into economics, which he tried to recapitulate here at BC with Pat Byrne and Charles Heffling and me being present. It just is so important for the present malaise that we're experiencing. So then, not only in terms of the method and in terms of the need for conversion, but also in terms of the concrete economic situation, you really have something to say that's cogent and has a normativity to it. And so there again, this tremendous gift.
Mm. When you think about what sort of the most important developments that still need to happen in terms of the future of Lonergan's studies or the influence of Lonergan on the wider theological academy or the wider academy, what comes to mind for you as particularly important that you'd like to see happen?
Well, I started as a seminarian and Lonergan was a priest, worried about the incapacity of the church sort of under the regime of Romanized control of meaning and ahistorical orthodoxy. And so that meant so much to me by way of continuation with my past as studying to be a priest, that Lonergan for me wasn't initially in any way thought of as a dissertation topic, but as a stepping stone to a career, but as still in terms of a vocation. So I realized in retrospect that I was pulled by Lonergan, and I feel like that was what God was doing. And so I worry that in the present situation of theological studies and job market and so forth and so on, that Lonergan studies can be, in a way, colonized by this situation, and this is compounded by the difficulty that there's a general idea that that's pervasive in among present-day theologians, that you don't have to be at all serious about philosophy, cognitional theory, metaphysics, in order to be a theologian. And so, what you also realize, Lonergan's famous statement about don't try to convert your doctor father, because it'll take him 3 years to read insight, and you can't expect that for someone. Well, it does take the time.
Yeah.
And the students accepted into the theology program, they don't have the time. And they have all these hoops to jump through.
Yeah.
And so there's a real difficulty there, which in many cases seems insurmountable. Thank God there are the exceptional students like yourself who take up the cudgels, take up the challenge.
Cudgels. That's great. That's what I'll become known for, I'm afraid.
So no, but you're not just that. But I mean, it is hard work, and it takes the time. And what counts then for authenticity, not that people can't have it on the basis of their having been evangelized. Chances are they haven't been evangelized, and there is a way in which the complex of moral, intellectual, moral, and religious conversion, they kind of mutually mediate each other. So if you get serious about any one of them, you're liable to get serious about the others. But what if you don't get serious about any of them?
Right.
or not necessarily because you're the spawn of the devil, but because your background has not made you susceptible of having that pull work for you. And there is the thing that, in some ways, the Lonergan I learned from was benefited by the bad education that sincere people were subjected to under the old system. Mm. So that you had this tremendous clarification by contrast, which was a lot simpler than the kind of contrast we would undergo today in conditions of sheer modernity and postmodernity.
Can you elaborate on that? Just another little step.
First of all, you had the emphasis in the old system that, especially the Catholic system, that belief was a matter of assent to the truth. And so, since truth was so important, then figuring out why theology needs contingent predications is really a matter of great concern. And also to get straight that what theology is doing is not proving anything, but understanding what you already hold to be true,
Right.
not only on the basis of assent, but all that goes into making the assent, which is that prior those prior gifts of grace that God gives us. So it seems to me that in the practical sphere, if you don't have these fundamental things at work in your horizon, it's a kind of recipe for burnout, and also it leaves you open to fads in a way that you don't have to be. Now, so take an example. You know very well, we have a fellow in our course, among our grad students now, who is enamored of Derrida, who is a very interesting and clever person, and he really thinks that if you make a judgment about the truth of something, you're doing something that you really cannot do. So for example, Derrida says somewhere, there's nothing outside the text. Well, that's a judgment.
Right.
What's the evidence for that? And so forth.
Right.
And so he has this notion of the truth, which is not taking into account that almost all the truths that anyone comes up with are really probable. They're based on the evidence you have.
Right.
To say something's possible or probable or certain. And that's as far as it goes. But in order to say, well, here's a better thing, you just bring more evidence, and an honest person will deal with it. But the idea that you could say something is true is considered to be absolutist and triumphalist and so forth. So those are difficulties that the modern or postmodern situation gets us into.
Right. It's a funny thing because it's its own version of a closed system. After all, text is a kind of a closed system.
Well, that's true. So in other words, what I was trying to say earlier is that coming from the scholastic system,
right,
the Lonergan was opening up everything,
right,
and he seemed so it's that thing about dialectics that counterpositions always see people in the position, in the opposite counterposition,
right,
rather than
right.
And I think that's the feeling that you often have in the conversations that we mostly have.
Yeah.
But the other big issue is we've already talked about it is learning Lonergan or learning about one's own conscious intentionality. It's difficult.
Yes.
And it seems to demand conditions that a certain kind of faith supports, and other kinds of faith seem not to.
Well, and there's already a way, it seems to me, in which the socialization of the academy discourages the real thing that he's inviting you to do, because insight isn't just another kind of text. There's a pedagogy that's really about you discovering something about yourself. And I think we're conditioned to interact with texts as occasions for launching them against each other and so forth, and insight doesn't really work that way.
Yeah, that's true.
So somehow there's a way in which...
just this weekend, the person we were talking about, the Derrida scholar, he quoted an email I wrote to him, to a group there, saying, even Derrida had to know what time the plane was leaving. But he said, well, it's not so clear. It might be postponed, or it might be...
Yeah.
But so there's a conscious feeling that you're more honest if you're not so definite.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you are definite, you're just apodictic. So it's the opposite counterposition.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, we probably have to wrap this up. This room is under siege.
Yeah, I see that.
And I think we've fulfilled our initial remit. So we'll be happy to see everybody in a couple of weeks and have a conversation with you then. Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you. I wish we could have another 30 minutes for me to ask you questions.
Well, maybe I've been spared by getting you to fill the time. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.